Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. One of the less discussed engagements of the Civil War occurred at Gaines Mill, Virginia on June 27th, 1862. The battle was wedged towards the middle of the 7 days battles that culminated at Malvern Hill, the end of Union Major General George B. McClellan's failed Peninsula Campaign, the well known campaign that began early in the spring of 1862, the press crying out on to Richmond, thinking that McClellan was going to lead his Army of the Potomac quickly along the peninsula and take Richmond. Of course, McClellan proved quite the opposite, slow moving and cautious, his engineering background perhaps and probably causing him to move much more slowly than a lot of folks, including President Abraham Lincoln, would have liked. The highlight of Gaines Mill was a powerful attack by two Confederate brigades commanded by Colonel Evander M Law, he's pictured here, and Brigadier General John Bell Hood of Texas. Hood is the name that most students of the Civil War recall and remember. He went on to command armies and wound up on the losing side of the Atlanta campaign and the battles of Franklin and Nashville. Law never achieved those heights of command. He remained a leader of a brigade through the rest of the war, largely remembered for his leadership at Gettysburg, particularly on July 2nd in the fighting around Little Round Top, and after that, his rocky professional relationship with General James Longstreet that played out in a bunch of different ways, none of them favorable for Law. But that was in 1864, Gettysburg, of course, in 1863. In 1862, that early part of the war, Law was a rising star in the galaxy of Confederate generals. At Gaines Mill was arguably his best performance of the entire war. Law was pretty quiet about his performance until about a quarter of a century later, when he wrote an essay for a magazine called The Southern Bivouac. It's actually a two-part essay that he wrote. I want to take some parts of Law's story, that Southern Bivouac story, and combine them with quotes from his adjutant, Lieutenant Robert T. Coles, who served with Law early on in the 4th Alabama. So let's go to the battlefield so we can get a sense of what happened on June 27th, 1862. Gunsmoke blanketed the field through which Law's brigade prepared to charge at Gaines Mill. It was early in the evening on June 27th. Law recalled its sulfurous source, that heavy gun smoke. It was on high ground on the opposite side of the field, about a quarter-mile distant. Law said, quote, "The fringe of woods along the Federal line was shrouded in smoke and seemed fairly to vomit forth a leaden and iron hail," end quote. Those enemy guns on the high ridge were supported by a line of infantry. Halfway down the elevation, a second line of infantry dug in behind freshly chopped logs. You could see they were still green. A third line entrenched at the base of the hill. In front of that line at the base of the hill was a marshy ravine, and it provided a natural layer of defense for the Union troops who were ready for just about anything. Adjutant Coles described the Union position as a perfect Gibraltar. This impregnable position marked the center of the Union line held by Major General Fitzjohn Porter's 5th Corps of McClellan's Army of the Potomac. So sort of a rear guard, this corps that was formed on this amazingly easy to defend, or seemingly easy to defend, position. Now, Law formed his brigade in two attacking lines. In the front, the 11th Mississippi and the 4th Alabama. That second line, the 2nd Mississippi and the 6th North Carolina. On Law's left was that brigade of Texans commanded by Hood. It was actually Texans and Georgians. While Law was forming his men and Law's officers on the regimental level were getting everybody ready for battle, Hood and his commanders were doing exactly the same thing. Everybody was prepared to join in this assault. Hood, I should mention, a native of Kentucky, had graduated from West Point in 1853 and had proven his abilities on the Western frontier before turning in his resignation, a career U.S. soldier, to fight for his adopted Texas and the Confederacy. Law had his own training at the Citadel in the 1850s. The two were roughly the same age, Hood a little bit older. But these two brigades of Law and Hood would not go it alone. General Robert E. Lee, the overall commander, he and his army had their back against the gates of Richmond. Lee wasn't ready to give up. He was going to fight back, and he amassed 16 brigades to attack the Union Army's rear guard. That was Fitzjohn Porter's corps, as McClellan was beginning to waver and was ordering a withdrawal to a more secure base of operation. There was attacks all throughout the day, and Law and Hood went in about 6:30 p.m., maybe 7 o'clock, depending upon various accounts. Law and Hood were under explicit orders from their division commander, a man who doesn't get a lot of attention, Major General Whiting. Whiting's orders were to march their brigades rapidly across the field toward a slight rise ahead of that ravine, and then hold their fire until they got close, and then let loose. Adjutant Coles recalled the drifts of Gunsmoke were limiting visibility to about 10 feet as the men braved a withering storm of lead that was whizzing and hissing and popping all around them. They continued on their trek across the battlefield as those thick drifts of gun smoke moved across, and they continued on, going up the rise and then continuing down towards the ravine where that first line of Union infantry was already blazing away at them. Those Union infantrymen squeezed the triggers of their muskets and blasted the oncoming Confederates of Law and Hood's brigades. The Union brother artillerymen up on the ridge, they pumped round after round at the gray attackers. The Alabamians, Mississippians, Texans, and Georgians fell with every passing second. The sights and sounds of bullets and shrapnel thumping and thudding into bodies through the misty fog, you could barely see what was going on, took 1,000 or more of Southern soldiers out of action. So the reports go. And still, Law's men and Hood's men continued to advance. Law picks up the narrative at this point. Remember, they're getting close to the ravine, still haven't fired a shot. Law recalls, quote, "The two gray lines swept silently and swiftly on. The pace became more rapid every moment. When 30 yards of the ravine and the men could see the desperate nature of the work in hand, a wild yell answered the roar of Federal musketry, and they rushed for the works. The Confederates were within 10 paces of them. The Federal in the front line broke cover and, leaving their log breastworks, swarmed up the hill in their rear, carrying away their second line with them in their route. Then," Law remembered, "we had our innings. As the blue surged up the hill in our front, the Confederate fire poured into it with terrible effect. The target was a large one, the range short, and scarcely a shot fired into that living mass could fail of its errand." End quote. A horrible scene. Law's and Hood's brigades completely shattered the Federal center. They withdrew up the hill, over the hill. There were men captured. There were pieces of artillery that Law's and Hood's brigade captured, totally obliterated that part of the battlefield. But as other of those brigades, those Confederate brigades, moved in and began to take advantage of the hole that was punched in the Union line by Law and Hood, night began to fall, and with it, General Fitzjohn Porter's mauled Fifth Corps was able to rejoin McClellan's main army. Nonetheless, Lee had won the day and his first significant tactical victory since being named commander of the Army of Northern Virginia less than 2 months earlier. On the U.S. side, McClellan, who was already wavering, that loss broke his spirit, prompting him to withdraw his army from the peninsula without achieving his goal of capturing Richmond, Virginia. The tandem assault by the brigades of Law and Hood made that success at Gaines' Mill possible. Official reports of the engagement provided the first draft of history in any battle, any campaign. Major General Whiting praised Law and Hood for their achievements, and Whiting called out the Texans for being the first to break the enemy line. Law, of course, was right in there with him. Stonewall Jackson, to whom Whiting's division temporarily reported, and other senior commanders echoed Whiting in their official reports, and they emphasized, of course, Hood's performance. Hood, the West Pointer, familiar to everyone. Law, maybe something of the outsider, a colonel versus Hood's brigadier. Hood also reported very concisely. He detailed the gallantry and the sacrifice of his officers and men. Law left behind no official after-action report. If you'll check out the official records of the War of the Rebellion, it's not there, and you can't compare it. There's nothing to compare to the timely writings of Hood and his senior commanders. So though Law was right in there with Hood, and probably right behind him, he didn't leave behind formal recognition of the deeds of his men and no detailing of his command decisions and other particulars of his part in the battle. As I mentioned earlier, Law's performance, arguably his best of the war, was left to his peers and his superiors to evaluate and contextualize. So there you have the story of Evander M. Law, colonel, commander of Law's brigade, and the Battle of Gaines' Mill, the less discussed battle right in the middle of the 7 days engagements that turned the tide of the Peninsula Campaign and saved Richmond. It was a Confederate army probably at about its finest, getting close to the pinnacle of its success. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.